Before we ride into this story, hit like and subscribe. Thank you. Kandahar Province, June 2009. The fighting season had already tightened its grip on the south, heat shimmering above grape rows, dust hanging in the air like smoke that never cleared, and the quiet certainty that every irrigation ditch could be a trench, every culvert a bomb. Lieutenant Aaron Reyes had been awake for most of the last 72 hours, not because he couldn't sleep, but because his platoon had been turning the same problem over and over until there were no edges left to cut them. 16 operators, 3 deployments together, a team that had learned each other's breathing patterns the way other men learn names. They'd rehearsed breaches until the order of movement lived in the tendons of their hands. When people talked about muscle memory, Reyes understood what they meant. It wasn't a metaphor, it was a survival system. The target was a Taliban compound tucked into the edges of Panjwai. High mud walls, narrow entrances, grape-drying sheds, and irrigation channels that forced you into lanes where you could be measured and shot like a man walking a hallway. The intel package was unusually clean. A courier had been rolled up in Kandahar city and had talked. A fingerprint match tied the man inside the compound to a network that was coordinating pressure plate IEDs along Route Summit, devices that had shredded convoys and patrols for months. Coalition dead weren't numbers in a report to Reyes. They were the empty chairs in the chow tent, the voice that didn't answer on the radio anymore, the quiet stare of an interpreter whose cousin hadn't come home. The plan accounted for everything Reyes could control: approach routes through the vineyards, breach points timed with dusk, contingencies for resistance, contingencies for civilians, contingencies for the geometry of Afghan compounds, the way a single doorway could turn an assault into a pile of bodies if you hit it wrong. And then the order arrived. Australian SASR inbound. ETA 1100 hours. Joint operation. Attached unit placed under Reyes' tactical control. 6 hours until wheels up. Reyes stared at the message longer than he should have. It wasn't resentment, it wasn't fear of the Australians. Everyone in the special operations world knew the regiment's reputation. The issue was predictability. His platoon wasn't just a collection of shooters, it was a nervous system, a living set of expectations. How fast a man moved when he was confident, how he paused when he was unsure, how he leaned into corners, how he cleared a room without needing to say, "I'm moving." 6 hours wasn't time to integrate. 6 hours was time to make a mistake together. At 1100, 2 helicopters dropped into the landing zone in a cloud of Kandahar dust. Reyes watched 12 figures step out. He'd seen units arrive wearing their own myth-like armor. Swagger, jokes too loud, postures meant to tell you they were the best before you ever saw them work. These men didn't strut. They flowed. No wasted movement, no fiddling with straps, no loud talk. They moved the way water moves. Efficient, inevitable, already where it needed to be. The team leader peeled off and crossed toward Reyes through the dust. Tall, sun-weathered, mid-30s maybe. Eyes that seemed to register 100 details without changing expression. "Captain Liam Kerr," he said. SASR. The handshake was firm, not theatrical. Kerr's gaze took in Reyes, the perimeter, the wind direction, the distance to the nearest wall. Calm and analytical, missing nothing. Reyes had expected to spend the afternoon managing an integration problem. He felt for the first time since the message that he might be wrong. But 6 hours was still 6 hours, and a compound full of Taliban didn't care about anyone's optimism. They moved into the planning room. Maps, a projector, a whiteboard already scarred with old routes and kill zones. Reyes laid out the compound in clean lines: approaches, breach points, timing, casualty collection, extraction. He spoke quickly, watching Kerr for confusion, pushback, the subtle jockeying that sometimes infected joint ops when pride wandered into the room. Kerr didn't interrupt. When Reyes finished, Kerr asked exactly 3 questions. "Your radio frequency plan. Do we have common presets, or are we patching through?" he asked. "Medevac timeline and assets," he continued, as if the first question had already been answered. Then he pointed to the compound diagram. "These courtyard walls, mud brick or stone reinforced. Any chance of a parapet firing position up top? No speeches. No attempts to renegotiate. No quiet grab for credit." 3 questions that stripped away ambiguities, the kind that got people killed when the lights went out. Reyes assigned sectors. His team would take the main gate. Kerr's team would breach the northern wall near a grape hut that intelligence said was used as a storage corridor leading into the inner rooms. Simultaneous entry at 1930, when dusk was enough to move and shadow was enough to confuse. Kerr repeated the timing back without error. Then he turned to his men and briefed them in a voice so low Reyes couldn't make out the words. The Australians asked no questions. They began checking weapons, comms, charges with a methodical attention that looked almost ceremonial. Reyes felt something he didn't often allow himself: relief. Then they moved to the rehearsal pit. This was where joint operations lived or died, not in the polished calm of a planning room, but in the dirt, where egos scraped together and friction turned into mistakes. They marked compound walls with tape and stones, walked angles, simulated distances, ran the breach sequence until boots carved lines into the ground. For the first 20 minutes, it was smoother than Reyes would have believed possible. The Australians read American hand signals without hesitation. They flowed through mock rooms at the same pace, matched the rhythm as if they'd been drilling together for years. Men who'd never worked together moved like a single machine. Then Petty Officer Haynes stopped everything. Haynes was young, 25, fast. Technically brilliant, still carrying the sharp edges of certainty. He pointed at the north breach point and said the Australian explosive placement was too conservative. A larger charge centered on the access door would guarantee faster entry and maintain momentum. Bigger blast, faster breach. Standard logic in a world where seconds could decide whether you lived. Kerr studied the mock-up, then looked at Haynes. His tone didn't rise. There was no edge, no insult. Intel says the hallway behind that door is used as sleeping space, Kerr said. Family, kids, center charge sends fragments into the living area at chest height. We use a linear cut on the hinges. Door drops, same speed, blast vents outward. The rehearsal pit went quiet. 28 operators stood in a circle of dust and tape, waiting for Reyes to decide what mattered more. His subordinate's confidence, or the calm logic of a man he'd met 4 hours ago. Haynes looked at Reyes, expecting backing. Kerr looked at no one in particular, like his case didn't require advocacy. Reyes stared at the dirt diagram. He saw the physics, he saw the discipline, and he saw something else. Something that mattered more than either. A moral clarity that had survived an open challenge and a countdown clock. We run it Kerr's way, Reyes said. He told Haynes to adjust their charges to match the Australian protocol. The tension didn't break into resentment. It shifted into recalibration. His own men saw a commander who valued competence over comfort. The Australians saw Americans who cared about the outcome more than hierarchy. In that pit of dust, the two units stopped being separate teams solving the same problem. They became one team with one plan. They ran it again and again and again, until the breach timing was identical and hesitation had been burned out of the sequence. Trust built in rehearsal is one thing. Trust when bullets start flying is something else entirely. They inserted 2 kilometers from the target and moved on foot, parallel columns through vineyards and irrigation ditches. The land was a quilt of hard earth and grape trellises, broken by canals deep enough to swallow a man. The air smelled like dust and vegetation and distant smoke. Reyes led his team toward the main gate. Kerr's Australians peeled left toward the north wall. Darkness thickened around both elements until they vanished from each other's sight. Radio comms were minimal. Clipped confirmations, position checks, no wasted words. The only sounds were wind through dry leaves and boots on hard ground. 8 minutes from the compound, Reyes realized something that made the hair on his arms lift beneath his sleeves. He could hear his own men moving, controlled, disciplined, the quiet of 16 men trying to be ghosts. He could not hear the Australians at all. At 19:30, Reyes pressed against the outer wall. A faint rectangle of light leaked through a shuttered window. Voices inside. Men talking, laughing, unaware that their world was about to be ripped open. Reyes keyed his radio. Set. Kerr's voice came back immediately. Calm, unhurried. The same tone he'd used in the pit, the planning room, the landing zone. As if violence was just another environment. North set. Reyes counted down. The charges detonated simultaneously. 1 sound, 2 breaches. The wall absorbed the blast and threw it back doubled. Even expecting it, Reyes felt it in his chest. A physical shove that stole breath. Dust surged outward. His team flowed through the main entry before the cloud peaked. Muzzles up, boots fast, bodies moving through muscle memory. Inside, the compound became a series of violent snapshots. Doorways, corners, silhouettes caught in shock. Taliban fighters stumbled into view, reactions slowed by concussion and surprise. Reyes' team engaged cleanly, room to room, dominating space before occupants could process what was happening. Then the courtyard, 5 fighters behind stacked crates and a low stone wall. A K-fire in controlled bursts, the kind that meant they'd rehearse too. Reyes pushed toward the corridor that would give him an angle, and hit the geometry that turned momentum into a stall, a fatal funnel, one direction, enemy fire covering every inch. He couldn't push without losing people. He couldn't flank without exposing his men to fire from above. The assault stopped. In a raid, a stall was where things got ugly. Then the radio crackled. Kerr's voice, not a question, a statement of intent. Moving to your east, 30 seconds. 30 seconds later, Australians appeared through the north corridor, an angle the Taliban hadn't covered because they'd assumed that flank was still being cleared. The insurgents were caught in a crossfire they couldn't answer. 15 seconds. Done. Reyes' team surged through, cleared the remaining rooms, and found the target in an inner space trying to vanish into a tunnel hidden under a rug. Hands zip-tied, face pushed into dirt, the smell of fear and sweat mixing with dust. Time from breach to objective secured. 8 minutes. 8 minutes old and already complete. Then the radio erupted again. Higher command, drone feed, urgency. Movement that pre-mission intelligence hadn't accounted for. A Taliban response force converging from a nearby village. 30-plus fighters moving fast through the same irrigation routes the teams had used. Estimated contact in 10 minutes. Extraction birds 12 minutes out. Reyes did the math without thinking. 2 minutes outnumbered, static in a compound, finite ammo, against men who knew this terrain like they knew their own homes. He made 2 calls. Prepare emergency extraction and push the helicopters as fast as physics allowed. Everyone knew the second call wouldn't change reality. Kerr received the information the same way he received everything else. A single nod. Then he started moving his men along the walls without waiting for detailed orders. Sectors assigned, fields of fire overlapped. Defensive plan built in under 90 seconds. Reyes watched and filed it away. No panic, no questions, no wasted speech. Just advanced work. The Taliban arrived at the perimeter with practiced efficiency. They used ditches as covered approaches, moving in coordinated elements that suggested this wasn't improvisation. Someone had planned for this. Someone had anticipated the raid might succeed and had positioned a counterattack. The first RPG slammed into the east wall and turned mud brick into razor fragments. Both teams hit the ground as one. Automatic fire began probing from 3 directions, trying to find the weak points. Reyes returned fire in controlled bursts, acquired targets, no wasted rounds. He could track the Australians by their cadence, rhythmic, methodical, the sound of accurate shooting rather than reactive volume. Kerr's voice moved through the radio in short, calm transmissions, shifting men by inches, shaping the perimeter as if he were adjusting furniture. 8 minutes. Then Reyes saw it. An Australian sergeant, a stocky man with a beard and eyes like glass, had identified a specific ditch line that Taliban fighters were committing to, using the damaged east wall as an entry point, not probing, committing. If they got in, the compound's weakest point would collapse before the helicopters arrived. The sergeant didn't ask permission. He calculated distance and arc in the dark under fire and threw a fragmentation grenade with the unhurried certainty of a man who had done it before. The grenade landed in the ditch and detonated perfectly. The approach folded, bodies tumbled. The primary advance route became a trap. Reyes keyed the radio. Nice throw. Kerr's reply carried the same flat tone he'd used explaining the hinge charge. That's Mac. He's good at that. 6 minutes. Denied their main route, the Taliban shifted effort toward the north side where the Australians held. The volume of incoming fire increased. Traces stitched over the wall. Dust shook loose from the mud bricks with every impact. The Australians didn't compress, didn't retreat, didn't ask Reyes whether they should hold or pull back. They held. 4 minutes. Reyes heard rotors before he saw lights. Helicopters inbound low, fast. Pilots threading through fire already tracking them. He made the call. Both teams to suppressive fire. Keep heads down. 90 seconds to touchdown. What happened in those 90 seconds became the detail Reyes would describe to every new leader he mentored afterward. The Australians didn't simply fire faster. They synchronized. Overlapping waves of suppression. Each burst timed to cover the gap left by the previous one, building a continuous wall of accurate fire that made it functionally impossible for Taliban fighters to raise weapons and aim effectively at the incoming aircraft. It wasn't volume. It was architecture. Fire designed, not panicked. The helicopters touched down hard. Both teams collapsed inward, moving to the aircraft in practiced order. Rear security maintained, still engaging targets as bodies loaded and harnesses snapped. Reyes counted heads automatically as he boarded. His men, Kerr's men, the detainee secured, gear accounted for. Then a round punched through the fuselage. It found Haynes, the young operator who challenged Kerr in the rehearsal pit, and dropped him to the floor. Blood soaked through his trousers immediately, dark in the cabin light. The helicopter was still taking fire. The door was open. Wind and dust tore through the cabin. Reyes lunged, grabbing for Haynes, trying to drag him away from the open door and incoming rounds. His mind was already splitting into tasks: tourniquet, cover, scream at the crew chief, count heads again, keep the detainee from moving. Before he could issue an order, 2 Australians unbuckled. No discussion, no hesitation. They moved across the cabin and physically positioned themselves between Haynes and the open door. Bodies turned into cover. One braced with his back to the fuselage, the other hunched over the wounded American, hands already working the wound with practiced speed while his shoulder shielded him from the doorway. They didn't move until the helicopter climbed, until the sound of incoming fire faded into distance and vibration. Reyes sat in the roaring darkness and stared at them. 11 hours ago, Haynes had stood in dust and tape and questioned their judgment. They hadn't forgotten, they just hadn't let it matter. Haynes lived. Surgical team waiting at the forward base. Blood transfusion, fast hands, controlled chaos under bright lights. Reyes stood outside on the tarmac, dust-caked, ears ringing, watching medics push his man toward the operating room. Kerr stood nearby and lit a cigarette like his hands had forgotten how to tremble. Steady, unhurried. The same man who'd stepped off the helicopter that morning and moved through every phase of the day as if panic simply wasn't an available option. Reyes walked over. He wanted to say everything. The 3 questions, the hinge charge logic, Mac's grenade, the synchronized suppression, the 2 Australians who'd turned their bodies into armor for a man they'd met that morning. But in that world, speeches were unnecessary. A nod could carry the weight of a citation. A handshake could say what language couldn't. Reyes extended his hand. Kerr took it, same firm, calm grip as before. Reyes said the one thing that mattered. You kept my people alive. Kerr's mouth twitched into the first genuine smile Reyes had seen from him all day. You did too. What the operation produced wasn't just a detainee. It was a broken link in a network that had been feeding explosives into the south. Routes disrupted, caches rolled up, pressure eased on patrols that had been walking into hidden death for months. The broader campaign didn't change overnight. Afghanistan never gave anyone that kind of clean victory. But for a stretch of time, fewer radios crackled with panic, fewer convoys vanished into smoke, fewer families received the knock. Over the next months, Reyes's platoon and Kerr's team ran mission after mission together. Different villages, different compounds, the same narrow lanes and irrigation ditches, the same stubborn stubborn enemy, the same dust. Senior commanders asked how a joint element was moving so smoothly when most coalitions took weeks to find a rhythm. Reyes always gave the same answer. They stopped being two units executing the same mission and became one unit that happened to contain Americans and Australians. The distance between allies and brothers isn't measured in nationality. It's measured in what happens when the door comes off, when the plan collapses, when the bullets start flying, and a wounded man is sliding toward an open helicopter door. That night in Kandahar, the Australians answered that question without words, by putting their bodies between danger and a teammate they'd known since breakfast.